Commissioner Jensen.
Here.
Commissioner Sayoc.
Here.
Commissioner Matici called and said he will be late tonight. Commissioner Talasford.
Here.
Commissioner Bourgeois.
Here.
And Chair O'Donnell.
Here.
And we have a quorum.
All right, if you'd all join me in the Pledge of Allegiance. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. I will make just a couple of introductory remarks for anyone who has not attended one of our meetings before. As you all know, this is the Planning Commission, but sometimes people don't know that the Planning Commission is different than the Town Council. The Town Council adopts the laws, we don't. We apply the laws. So if you speak to us this evening, try to keep in mind who we are and what our limited abilities are, and focus, if you would, on what we can do. Otherwise, you kind of waste some of your good words. Everybody will have an opportunity to speak. We begin the meeting eventually here by opening up to public comment on matters not on the agenda. And if you want to speak to that kind of thing, you fill out a card, which is in front of you if you're sitting on a back bench there, and you submit it up to the clerk. If you're going to speak on an item which is on the agenda, you also submit a card, and please put your name and address and which agenda item, and turn that in. And I've got some cards here, and I'll call them in order. An applicant gets up to 5 minutes to speak initially. Citizens can come up and speak either for it or against it, and they would get up to 3 minutes. And then the applicant concludes with up to 3 minutes. The matter is then closed, and the Planning Commission gets an opportunity to discuss it, and ultimately a motion is normally made, and eventually a motion is normally adopted. So that will be our procedure tonight. I'd also tell you things you've heard at every meeting you've ever been to, and that is if you have a little thing like a cell phone that makes noise, if you put it on vibration or something that doesn't make noise, we'd all appreciate that. All right, so that's just the housekeeping that I wanted to get to. The next matter we have is the approval of minutes, and the minutes we have before us are the August 26th minutes, and I'd like to have a motion. Commissioner Talasford?
Yeah, Commissioner O'Donnell, I will be abstaining from that vote because I did recuse myself for part of that meeting, and I don't think it's fair that I vote on the minutes.
Thank you. Any other comments before a motion? Is there a motion? Commissioner Erickson?
I would move adoption of the minutes for the meeting of August 26th as distributed in the packet to the Commission.
Is there a second?
Second.
Commissioner Bourgeois. All those in favor? Aye. Anyone opposed? And one abstention. And one person with an excused absence. Okay. Written communications. We have before us a couple of desk items, one desk item on item number 1, and one desk item on item number 4. And if any commissioner has not had an opportunity to read this by the time we get there, please let me know, and we will take the time to do it. Any other written communications?
No, we've not received any others.
Okay. I see no requested continuances. Now, in subcommittee reports, I know we've had at least one subcommittee. Commissioner Bourgeois?
Yes, the General Plan Committee met earlier tonight to review the revised draft housing element goals and policies. We've had a couple meetings discussing those. We provided input to the town staff and consultants. They came back to us, and we did one final read-through, and I assume the next step is that will be coming to Planning Commission. Also, the General Plan Advisory Committee met last week to go over the new goals and policies, the proposed new goals and policies for the environment and sustainability section of the general plan update.
Okay, I would mention that there's a lot of activity now on the general plan, and as Commissioner Bourgeois indicated, we're into the real meat of it, and so if any of you want to attend any of these meetings, they are noticed, and you're certainly welcome to come. The general plan is an important document. Any other subcommittee reports? All right. Verbal communications. I have one card, Citizen Ray.
Hey, Citizen Ray. Way to go, Ray. Make my day. Hey, hey, hey. You know, when you reach the point of being a civic guru, like myself, you got to have a chant. Make sure nobody's asleep. Nobody smiles? There's some smile. Thank you. Yes, back to seriousness. Sorry Mr. Machichi isn't here today. You were all here and you heard what happened at the last meeting. Now, at the next meeting, I would hope that he show up, because I'm going to give him a chance to apologize. Because he's a man with a family raising kids, still. And I hate to take on that kind of a person politically. But if he doesn't apologize, we're going to have a little 3-minute discussion at the next meeting, if he shows up. First off, for those of you that watched the council meeting last night, you know how on the Francis Oaks Drive matter, you were torn apart. Literally, I couldn't believe it. The assumptions they made about what you were thinking when you did this and did that. Couldn't believe it. They spent at least an hour talking about what the Planning Commission must have been thinking of to come to such a decision to deny that application. Unbelievable. Every community that I've ever lived in, whenever there's an appeal from the Planning Commission, the chairman of the Planning Commission is invited to the town council meeting to speak and answer questions. Los Gatos is the only community that doesn't do that. And why don't they do it? Because they can cut you to pieces and nobody is there to rebut. It is so disgusting. I can't believe any of you are considering re-upping your duty. Okay? Ugly. Maybe it'll change. I hope so. So I will continue to criticize. And I will continue to use the First Amendment and all the American options that we have to disagree with the disagreeable. Okay? Next. Cement plant. Coming up September 17th at Quinlan Community Center. May I finish? Cupertino Room, 10185 North Stelling Road, Cupertino. And that is, go down De Anza Boulevard in Cupertino. Then you hit Stevens Creek Boulevard, turn left, it's on your right. There you are. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
I'm sure people can find the place, but thank you. Thank you. All right. All right, the first matter we have now is agenda item number 1, that's 14680 Quito Road. And I will ask staff for their report.
Thank you. Assistant Planner Marnie Mosley will be presenting a report tonight.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The proposed application was first reviewed by the Planning Commission on June 24th, 2009. The item was continued to allow the applicant to address some of the neighbors' concerns in regards to visibility of the accessory structures. The application was reviewed again by the Planning Commission on July 8th, 2009. The applicant presented proposed mitigation that included increasing the setback of both the accessory structures from 3 feet to 5 feet. He also proposed moving the art studio 2 feet closer to the rear property line and reducing the depth of the attached trellis by 2 feet. The applicant also proposed to plant varying species of evergreen trees between the structures and the property lines for screening. The proposed mitigation was not accepted by the neighbors, and the application was continued to this evening to allow the applicant and the neighbors adequate time to come to an agreement if possible. The neighbors and the applicant have agreed upon several mitigation factors. Both directly impacted neighbors have spelled out the mitigation measures agreed upon and signed an affidavit. These agreements are in the desk item in front of you. Most of the items are already included in the plans you received in your packets, which is Exhibit 15. Several of them were either not clear on the plans or are not such that could be detailed on the plans. The screening trees, removal of the 2 spruce trees, and the painting of the garage are listed as conditions the Planning Commission should include if the application is approved. Item number 5 on the agreement with the Popes is not an item the town can enforce. The signed agreement should provide for enforcement through a civil process if necessary, though. All the mitigation measures have been reviewed by staff and are consistent with the proposed plans and applicable town requirements. Staff recommends the Planning Commission approve the application subject to the attached conditions as well as those included in your desk item. That concludes staff's report. I'm here if you have any questions.
Thank you. Other questions? Seeing none, I'd ask the applicant to come forward. I believe it's Dennis Hayes.
In the process of getting the prints done, we accidentally forgot to put the floor plan in there, so I'd like to hand out a copy of the floor plan of the garage to you so you can see that.
Fine. And when you get back, please identify yourself and let us have your address. Okay. I don't think we should start the clock on this. Okay.
My name is Dennis Hayes, and I'm the applicant for Lyle and Lola Wagner. As you know, last meeting for this project, there were still some concerns by the neighbors as far as the visual impacts of the art studio and the garage. As a result, the homeowner, Mr. Wagner, had a series of meetings with both the Laughlins and the Popes to remedy some of these concerns. Also, in doing so, we were able to get written agreements between the Popes and the Laughlins with the remedies for the concerns. I'd like to put a color copy of the site plan, and I can kind of talk about those as I go down through the items. Okay, the first item is regarding the garage. One of the things we did to kind of help with the garage was to give it a step in the setback. For approximately 30 feet of it, we've increased the setback to 7 feet from the property line, and that's right in this area right here. The other 5-foot setback continues for 25 feet. Additionally, what we did was we eliminated the parapet wall on the back side of that garage, and that basically reduces 2 feet from the height of that structure. One of the other items that we wanted to deal with was screening, and we are going to be putting 12 Tristania laurel trees 5 feet apart, clear across the back side of the garage. And additionally, the Wagners are going to remove 2 of those spruce trees because they drop a lot of pine cones, that sort of stuff, into the Laughlin's backyard. Another thing we're going to do is paint the rear wall of the garage an earth tone color, and that will be something that the Laughlins and the Wagners can work out as far as what would be an acceptable color to do the back side of the garage. The other item was the art studio. So what we did on the art studio, that directly affects the Popes. And what we've done with that is we moved it an additional 6 feet to the east and completely eliminated the arbor structure. And that pretty much gets it completely out of visual impact to the Laughlins. Additionally, we're going to be putting 5 Tristana laurel trees 5 feet apart on that one. Also, the Wagners and the Popes agreed that there's 2 black acacia trees, and those are going to remain for a minimum of 2 years. With these design changes, the Popes agree that there will be reduced and acceptable visual impact, and will agree to support the Wagners project. Mr. Wagner also spoke with Mr. McCarney, which is one more house down, and he said as long as the Pope signed the agreement, he felt comfortable with the arrangement of the building, with the new location of the building. Also, Mr. Wagner spoke briefly with Mrs. Lundgaard this morning, or actually, I'm sorry, tonight, prior to the meeting, and she might have some questions, but she's still absorbing the information, but he got a sense that she felt a little bit more comfortable with it. Any other questions?
Other questions? Thank you very much. I have one card, so if anybody else wants to speak, now's the time to fill out a card. I have a card from Dennis McCarney.
Dennis McCarney, 116 Montclair Road. This will be pretty short. I assume you guys have a copy of the Pope's Agreement, right? And I support everything that's on that as it's written, which is not quite the same as in the agenda. So I just want to make that clear that as it's written here, I have no problem with this, and as I told Mr. Wagner. So if this is what you approve, no issues.
We have, as our desk item, a copy of that agreement.
Okay.
So we all have it before us. Are there any questions of this speaker? All right, thank you very much, sir. No one else has submitted a card, so now would be the time for Mr. Hayes to come back if there's anything that he feels that needs to be added. He says no, so I will close the public hearing, and I will ask the planning commissioners if they have any comments or questions, or if anyone has a motion. Commissioner Talasfore.
Right. My comment is in the form of a motion to approve 14680 Keto Road, and for the specific reason that I'm very satisfied upon hearing, reading my report and then hearing the presentation tonight, plus the neighbors signing this other agreement. I think you've crossed your T's and dotted your I's. What a perfect ending to this. Thank you so much. So I'm to make a motion if everyone, all right. I would move then, make sure I have it in front of me, that we approve, okay, where is it? Where, hello, Joanne, okay. I would find that we approve the project, well, at Keto Road, but isn't there the architecture and site application, here it is. I haven't made a motion for so long. S-09-005, and I can make the findings that the project is categorically exempt pursuant to Section 15303 of the California Environmental Quality Act as adopted by the town, Exhibit 2. I can make the required findings in Section 2910-09030 of the Town Code for the demolition of a single-family residence, Exhibit 2, and required considerations by Section 2920-150 of the Town Code for granting approval of our architecture and site application in Exhibit 2, and that the requested floor area exception is appropriate given the site and characteristics existing and proposed development, neighborhood compatibility, and supporting evidence submitted by the applicant. And I determined that the project is in compliance with the single and two-family residential design guidelines, and approve the architecture and site. I already said that. And I would like to include in the conditions, as in our desk item for number 1, number 12 for the landscape screening. I don't think I need to read that, do I? And also number 13, which would be the paint selection of an earth tone color. Have I left anything out?
I don't think so. Is there a second? Commissioner Erickson?
Second.
Are there comments or questions, discussion? All those in favor, say aye.
Aye.
Aye. Is anyone opposed? So there's one abstention, otherwise it is unanimous. Thank you very much. We're going to defer item 2, which is the zoning ordinance amendment, to the end of the agenda. So if we can skip directly to item number 3.
And excuse me, Mr. Chair, I just want to play our town attorney's role, that there are appeal rights for anyone that feels is aggrieved by this decision, and that's 10 calendar days from today.
You're the first non-lawyer I've ever met that wanted to be a lawyer. All right. Okay, so item number 3 is relates to 347 Matsell Avenue, and I'll ask for a staff report.
Thank you. Associate Planner Joe Paulson will be presenting that tonight.
Good evening, Commissioners. On December 15th of 2008, the Town Council approved adopted an ordinance approving the conversion of the existing Bay Tree apartments into condominiums. That proposal also had other parking lot and site improvements associated with it to increase parking on site. Part of the approval required that the architecture and site for the exterior modifications and parking lot and site improvements, as well as the subdivision application, be processed after that was adopted. The applicant submitted their application for architecture and site approval and the subdivision pursuant to those development standards. For the architecture and site approval, the applicant is proposing to make modifications to the existing apartment buildings. The improvements include adding 3 new stairway tower elements that will be composed of cedar shingle siding. They'll also add cedar wood shingle siding to all of the existing fenced patio areas and balconies. They will replace all of the existing windows with double pane windows, and that also includes patio doors. Additionally, they're going to add some rock to the landscape wall that the signage is currently located on, which faces Massal Avenue. And the last two are, one is going to be a new lower roof element in the pedestrian entry from Massal that will have 4 pillars that will be comprised of stone exterior materials. And then they'll also add stone face pillars and fencing similar to the north auto entry at the south auto entry to try to tie those together. The consulting architects reviewed the application, and he stated that the changes seemed appropriate to the existing building as well as the surrounding neighborhood. The proposed exterior modifications are consistent with the renderings for the concepts that were provided during both the commission and council review of the application. The parking lot and site modifications deal with adding new parking spaces, and that's going to be accomplished by restriping some of the existing areas to add tandem spaces, restriping a couple other areas which currently don't have parking to create new spaces, and then making minor modifications in 2 areas of common open space that will provide 3 additional parking spaces. Again, the proposed parking lot and site improvements are consistent with the approved and adopted plan development ordinance. The second application is for the subdivision. Subdivision will create the condominium parcels that will be the same configuration as the existing apartments as they were originally constructed. In conclusion, the subdivision, architecture and site improvements, parking lot and site improvements are all consistent with the approved plan development ordinance that was adopted by the council. And so staff recommends that the commission approve those modifications. And the applicant is here, I believe, somewhere. I don't see him, actually, to speak. Hopefully he's not on a plane stuck somewhere. But if we're here to answer any questions that the commission may have.
Are there questions? There are no questions, so now we get to find out whether the applicant is here. It's rather unusual. What I think we can do, on the hope that the applicant is merely running late, and this, to be fair to everyone, I will extend an opportunity now to have anybody else who is here, I only have 1 card, who can speak, or they certainly don't have to. They can wait till the applicant is either here or not. But we're in a position now where we can either go ahead and make a decision based on the record which is before us without the applicant speaking, which we can do. So I'm kind of on the horns of a dilemma. I want the one speaker to be able to speak, and I would certainly invite him to do that. If it turns out that the applicant shows up late and before we close the public hearing, I will give that same speaker an opportunity to respond to anything that's said. So I want to be fair on this, but it doesn't look promising that the applicant's going to be here. So that being the case, I'm going to invite, and I'm not sure I can read the last name correctly. Is it, it's George Havelka? Okay.
Hi, my name is George Havelka. I live at 352 Bachman Court, which is right behind Bay Tree. And what I wanted to comment on today was critique the architectural changes. This is an obvious mid-century modern apartment building, and to apply arts and crafts design elements to it is like putting frosting on a cake. You know, it's the cake underneath is still a mid-century modern building. And this community in particular seems hell-bent on going after arts and crafts design everywhere. I just wanted to bring up one photo in here, which is from this Los Gatos history book, which is at Costco and lots of other places. But this is a mid-century modern version of the Opera House, which looks ridiculous. And to me, it looks as ridiculous as turning a mid-century modern building into a neo-arts and crafts thing. I think it should be left the way it was. I liked it the way it was. I think it looked fine the way it was. I have no problems with it the way it was. I don't have that much problem with the change either. But I wish that we'd slow down a little bit at trying to turn everything in this town into this homogeneous arts and crafts Victorian old thing. And that's my comment.
All right. Are there questions of the speaker? Seeing no questions, thank you very much, sir.
Thank you.
I don't have a card from anyone else. We don't have the applicant. I am going to close the public hearing. And I do want to say something. I think we can respond. I think the speaker, the one speaker we did have, raised some very good points, and I think it would be helpful if staff could respond, because our architect did make comments on this design, and also there were some comments on why they were changing it the way they were changing it. One perhaps will not ultimately agree with it or not, but at least there was some thought behind it, and I thought perhaps you could share that with us.
Well, you're correct. The consulting architect reviewed it, and obviously these are fairly minor modifications in the grand scheme of things. Some may, as Mr. Havelka said, liked it the way it was. Some may have preferred that they went much farther and really changed the entire exterior facades. The applicant is proposing, through their architect, who is Gary Schlow, to add treatments to kind of improve what's out there now from what is, as he said, a mid-century building that some may think is rather plain. So they're trying to strike a balance in between making a complete renovation of the exterior versus doing nothing at all. I will try to pull out the information from the applicant here in 1 second.
While you're doing that, I'm going to invite any comments from the planning commissioners, either on that line or anything else you want to raise before we get into motions. Commissioner Telesfor, you look like you want to say something.
I do. I do have some questions. I'm disappointed the applicant's not here. Maybe you can answer them. I wanted to know specifically a question about lighting, and I know that the staircases now are enclosed in this tower element, and I wanted to know if there would be security lighting in that tower element.
They will be required to include lighting for safety.
For safety.
Provisions.
And is that going to be bright lighting? Help me out with what that means by security, and is it 24 hours?
Staff wouldn't be looking for motion censored floodlights up in those tower elements. They would be elements that try to confine the lighting into there so that we're not creating beacons out of those openings to the neighbors, and staff will review that during building permits. We understand your concern.
And is that true of all the lighting then, Mr. Paulson, including the new entry lighting?
We will look at all of those. Typically, the lighting is mounted up under those and doesn't shine out as far. And it appears we have the architect here who might be able to shed a little more light on that issue.
Let me do this. We'd all be benefited, I believe, if I reopen the public hearing. As I indicated, I'm not trying to prejudice this speaker, so you'll have another opportunity if you wish to. But the applicant's representative is here tonight, so as soon as you get your breath, you would come forward and take an opportunity to tell us a little bit about the project. Well, whoever wants to be here ought to be here.
The applicant has just entered, so we actually started the public hearing without you. Things moved along a little quicker than we expected.
Going very well, so I don't know.
And so what I suggest is you have an opportunity to come up and speak for 5 minutes, or you can answer questions from the commission, and I'll leave that up to the chair.
You can go ahead with the regular thing you want to do. You get up to 5 minutes. I will tell you that we've only had one speaker in your absence. The only question that was raised was, why are you taking a mid-century building and touching it up the way you're touching it up, which really, I'm sure I'm misphrasing it, but it's neither fish nor fowl. And so that's the criticism. We have not responded to that. Staff was now responding in your absence. So, Mr. Slow, if you want to go ahead and do anything you want to say, or if you want to focus on the only issue that so far we have, and Commissioner Telesfor was asking some questions, and others may too, it's your choice, or actually your client's choice.
Can I just say a couple?
Please do. Now we'll start the applicant's time.
Planning Commission, my name is Ron Cole, the applicant for the Bay Tree Apartments. First of all, thank you for hearing our application, and I apologize for being late. Plane just landed a little bit later than expected. So anyway, as I've met a number of you during the process over the last few years, and as the project has been reviewed for the conversion, and the architectural improvements have been part and parcel to the application since 2005 when we began this process. And from the beginning, we hired Gary Schlow at numerous recommendations from various residents throughout the town, and I can't tell you how pleased we are with the the proposal and the concept that he's come up with, and ultimately what's come to the ANS review today. So I know that I'll keep it brief because it doesn't sound like there are too many specific questions about who Lion is or our intentions or timing, but I'm here to answer any questions that might be that might come up. So. Just
so the record will be correct, when you say you've met us over a period of years, I don't assume you met us individually.
Not individually, no, just throughout various commission and committee meetings.
We have strong instructions not to discuss these matters with,
and that is the case,
applicants. Okay.
Yeah.
If there are questions of Mr. Cole or Mr. Slow, who's in the audience, now is the time to ask them. And I think Commissioner Telesfor, well, first I should say this. We had one speaker. He may not want to speak again, so when you're through, we may not have anybody. So, Commissioner Telesfor, if you have some questions, would you like to direct them to the applicant?
Sure. I asked the question, maybe let me start with, I have another question and then we can follow into it. My first question that I was asking Joel was specifically about lighting and your lighting plan and how you planned on lighting the enclosed staircases, which I think is a really good addition to this building. That being said, my other question has to do with well, anyway, can you explain the lighting on that? And I assume it's going to be 24 hours?
Yes. Well, the lighting...
Security?
Yes. The lighting plan for the specific towers themselves, we haven't gone to construction drawing phase just yet. Predominantly everything has been conceptual drawings until we get an approval from Planning Commission. We will then contract with the engineers and the architects to go ahead and produce the construction drawings that will then be handed off to our construction team to implement. We will absolutely make sure that from a lighting and security standpoint, those towers are absolutely safe and meet all the codes that are required.
And I'm not sure that this would be code, but can you install motion sensors instead of lighting 24 hours? Is that, I don't know, is that can you do that?
Where are you directing that to?
Oh,
Install them where?
In the stairwell. I was just thinking, instead of having them, since it's in a neighborhood, instead of having it act as a constant light. Question. That's just a question.
You know, I'm not sure
That's all right.
where we would go with that just yet, only because it might be close to somebody's window, and having it go on and off as opposed to kind of constant might be distracting, but...
Yeah, I'm not even sure it could be a choice.
I don't know this, and maybe it would help. Are there code requirements for lighting on stairwells and that kind of thing that I don't know?
The building code has lighting requirements that would, we can definitely explore options to minimize that. Obviously, we'll have to weigh the pros and cons of whether it's a motion sensor. I think the challenge would be one from as Mr. Cole has explained, if it's next to a window, flashing on and off may be problematic. The other thing that may be problematic is that if it's not something that's constant, if a motion sensor fails, or you know, where do you put them, at the top and the bottom? And we would have to make sure that that met building code, but that's something we can explore at building phase.
Okay.
Are there other questions? Yes, Commissioner Jensen.
Is this the time to ask questions of Mr. Schlow as well, or just?
Yes, I think so, unless you have an intention to call Mr. Schlow in any event. Mr. Cole?
No, I was just going to have him come up.
Yes, please do. And Mr. Schlow, why don't you come forward, identify yourself and your address, and then that would be helpful to have both of you there.
Good evening. My name, excuse me, my voice, I've lost my voice, but I'll do the best. Gary Schlow, architect at 213 Bean Avenue. And I'm, like Mr. Cole says, I'm acting as their architect on this conceptual design. So I'm ready for any questions.
Mr. Schlow, good evening. I was just wanted you to be able to comment. You didn't hear the speaker that did talk to us, who pointed out that this is a mid-century building and wondered why the arts and crafts treatment, and felt that there was a plethora of arts and crafts treatments in the town of Los Gatos. So I wonder if you could address why you chose that.
I'm going to try. Like George said, I met him this morning in front of my office. I was sweeping the streets at the time. And we discussed, he had just come back from the town over here looking at the plans. It's a little bit difficult to answer that. I'll do the best I can. I think what sets this new design separate from what was existing there are basically these towers and the gateways, the building materials themselves, and the windows and doors and circulation is remaining unchanged. But I guess I came up with the idea of breaking this what I considered a monotonous horizontal line at the second story as well as at the first story of something that really I felt needed some a spark to the design. And I was not thinking so much of Victorian or Craftsman or some other style. I was just feeling that we needed something on this building to bring it into the new century, and so I don't know if that's answering any part of your question or not, but I feel like the quality of the design, and by the way, I know the son of the architect who did this building back in 1960s, and they did a lot of really fine design, and I think this was a building that would fit very well in the 1960s and 70s, and as it gets to the 80s and 90s and on, I think it needed some paint as well as it needed a little more embellishment on the design of the structure.
Other questions that Commissioner Telesfor?
I would like to compliment you on the selection of materials. I think it's sensitive to the neighborhood, the surrounding neighborhood.
Thank you.
And since you did bring it up, I do have to ask you, the tower And what's the height of the tower? How much does it stand over the roof? And
Okay.
can you tell me why a tower?
Yeah, the tower stands at its peak compared to the peak of the existing roof is 4 feet higher. Only that's at the peak, and then it falls down to 2 feet higher. So, when you look at something like this in perspective, you have to be careful where you stand, because some areas, well, the perspective drawing, it appears perhaps that it's much higher and much bigger, but you look at the elevations, and that's in a better context, I think, because it's more, as everybody will see it, it's pretty mellow as far as the height of the structure. The overall height of the tower from ground level, I'm remembering 26 or 27 feet, but I'm not sure. But I know from a standpoint of where the building is now and where the new towers are is 4 feet more in height.
Follow-up question. And how do you think it fits into the general historic neighborhood? And why do you think it fits into the general historic neighborhood that it's in?
It's got a lot to do with the detail that I'm putting into the design of the tower, because like I say, I'm not changing detail of any of the balconies or the fences or the roof overhangs. So it's just an embellishment that helps to define the important parts of the building, number one being where the general public walk into the complex, and that's flanked by 2 towers. And then as you walk through the opening, ahead of you is 1 additional tower. I felt like, it's hard to do 360-degree architecture on every building, but I felt like let's get 2 of those out in front and 1 halfway back, which sets back of the swimming pool. And so I think therein lies the 360-degree architecture that I think is prevalent throughout, or we want it to be prevalent throughout Los Gatos.
Yes, go ahead.
One more. It just follows up. Could you have designed the enclosed staircase without the 4 feet above that roof line?
I could have, but I think it would have lost its purpose. I think it needs a break. The horizontal line needs a break where at those stairwells. Those stairwells, it's a different use on the project, and I just think it has to do with curb appeal and the aesthetics for the entire project.
Thank you.
Are there other questions of either gentleman? Thank you very much. Mr. Havelka, would you like to speak again?
Yes, just for a moment.
Okay, so if you two will sit down, I'll give you a chance in a moment. Let me also comment that we have very limited abilities when it comes to redesigning buildings. In fact, one would argue we have no ability to redesign.
I'm not, yeah.
Okay. I'm just saying that in general,
okay,
so we
yeah.
don't get carried away with redesigning the building.
Yep. My comments are directed more at you. I have no beef with Bay Tree, Lyon. I live right behind the creek. I've had no problem with the development. I think what they've done so far, and I got behind the color change too, wrote a letter about that. I love the new colors. I think they're great. And Gary's work as well. I think Gary's work, given the desire to make some changes in order to fit into the neighborhood, I think he did really, really well. And this is a very horizontal building, and in order to have some vertical element in it, I do think it should stick up above a little bit. My comment is more about fits in the neighborhood. Why does it have to fit in the neighborhood. We need some diversity. That's why I'm here to talk tonight. We need some architectural diversity. Just because many of the homes here are one way does not mean that we have to continue that throughout every block in this neighborhood. We need to have somebody do some wild stuff here, and that needs to be allowed. And this is a fine solution to this issue. But I hate to see everybody that comes before planning or architectural review or whatever have to present something that fits into the neighborhood. That's why I wanted to talk.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Are there any questions of the speaker? All right, there being none, I'll ask the applicant if you have anything to add. All right, we'll again close the public hearing. And I will ask the commission again if you have any questions of staff, any comments, or a motion. You have to have one of those. Okay, Commissioner Bourgeois.
Thank you. I'm going to make a brief comment, and then I'm going to go right into a motion. I think a lot of these issues were discussed in fairly great detail during the PD process, both by the commission and the town council. And I think what we have in front of us is completely consistent with the PD. I think it's what we expected to see, and I personally don't have any comments or concerns about what's being proposed. So I am going to go ahead and make a motion to approve architecture and site application S-09-21, subject to the conditions in Exhibit 3. And to do that, I can make the findings that the ANS application is consistent with the PD ordinance 2171. I can't find actually any differences from the PD to this plan. I can find that the architecture and site application is consistent with the redevelopment plan for the Central Los Gatos redevelopment project area, and that the ANS application is consistent with the considerations for approval of architecture and site applications. I'd also like to make, as part of my motion, approval of subdivision application M-09-05, subject to the conditions in Exhibit 4. I can find that the subdivision is categorically exempt pursuant to Section 15301K of the state CEQA guidelines, that it's consistent, again, with the PD Ordinance 2171. I cannot make any of the findings for denial of the Subdivision Act, as outlined in Exhibit 2, and that the subdivision is also consistent with the redevelopment plan. And that's my motion.
Is there a second? Commissioner Sack, is there discussion? All those in favor say aye. Aye.
Chair, sorry to interrupt. There was one other finding that needed to be made for the architecture and site that unfortunately was not on the last sheet of the staff report, but is in Exhibit 2, which is the first one, that it's categorically exempt pursuant to 15301 for the architecture and site application as referenced in Exhibit 2. So if you could add that.
If I could add that.
Yeah. And the seconder will agree with that. All right. We now have an amended motion. All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Aye. Anyone opposed? No. One abstention. Okay, we can move on to item 4, I guess it is. Yes. This is 416 North Santa Cruz Avenue.
And, Mr. Chair, I just want to again talk about appeal rights. So any party that is aggrieved by this decision has 10 days from today to appeal this project. And that's done by submitting a letter to the town clerk and relevant fees.
Thank you. All right. Ask the staff for a report.
Thank you. Assistant Planner Jennifer Savage will be presenting the project tonight.
Good evening, Chair, Commissioners. I'd like to note that there is a desk item and it is available here at the left of the room if anyone is interested. The subject property is located at 414 and 416 North Santa Cruz Avenue, approximately 250 feet north of Los Gatos Saratoga Road. The property is zoned neighborhood commercial and surrounded by commercial uses to the north, west, and south. To the east is a town parking lot, beyond which is single-family residential uses. The applicants are requesting a conditional use permit to allow a retail wine establishment with food and wine service. The applicant submitted a written description and a letter of justification describing the proposed business. The proposed business offers wine by the bottle, wine accessories, and specialty food items for sale. They also offer food and beverage service, including wine and beer. The business has a maximum of 16 seats. The wine tasting and food service area is about 10% of the total lease space. According to the applicants, the food and wine service provides their customers a well-rounded wine education and a full wine experience. The wine education and experience is further enhanced through limited special events. The special events consist of private tastings and wine education classes and corporate events. The special events would be limited to 2 a month and have a total of 25 attendees on site at any given time. The operation hours would be Monday through Wednesday from 10 a.m. to 9 p.m., Thursday from 10 a.m. to 10 p.m., Friday and Saturday from 10 a.m. to 11 p.m., and Sunday from noon until 8 p.m. Wine service would cease 1 hour prior to closing. Because the retail aspect is a large component of the business and the use includes wine education classes, the use does not appear to fit into the town's definitions of a bar or a restaurant. However, the application is subject to the alcohol beverage policy because the use includes the service of alcohol. The purpose of the alcoholic beverage policy is to provide parameters for alcohol beverage service and direction through a general policy and a specific policy. The general policy contains 8 requirements. Requirement 1 does not apply to the application because it is not a standalone bar or a restaurant with a separate bar. Requirements 2, 3, 4, 6, and 8 do not apply because there is no entertainment, no alcohol beverage service after 10 p.m., and no outdoor seating. The application meets requirements 5 and 7 because the application is subject to required provisions and offers a selection of food from a menu. The intent of the specific policy is to ensure food will be served in conjunction with alcoholic beverage service. The proposal is consistent with the intent of the policy because food service will be available during alcohol beverage service. The alcoholic beverage policy requires specific findings for alcohol service after 10 p.m. These findings are not required in this case because the subject application does not include alcoholic beverage service after 10 p.m. The applicants are proposing to serve beer as noted in their letter of justification. However, given the town's historical concern for establishments that serve alcohol, staff is recommending that for the first 2 years of their operation, the use be limited to serving wine only. After 2 years, staff would conduct an administrative review of the operations, and provided there are no reported issues, the applicants would be continued to serve wine as well as beer. Staff recommends a condition for the administrative review to occur 2 years from the date that the business opens to the public. The requirements contained in the alcohol beverage policy are intended to protect nearby residential neighborhoods while maintaining the viability of our commercial centers. The applicants are sensitive to the nearby residential uses. The applicants operate an existing business in a neighboring community, and this business operates beneath residential condominiums. They have not had a single complaint or incident in the 6 years that their business has been in operation. The use will provide retail and basic food and beverage service to the community, as well as bring visitors, shoppers, and residents to a less frequented area of North Santa Cruz Avenue. The economic viability of the town's neighborhood commercial centers can be contingent upon the number of vacancies, and currently there are 9 vacancies at this particular shopping center. The addition of this use would increase the center's viability. Pursuant to the town's alcohol beverage policy, the Planning Commission shall review the application and provide a recommendation to Town Council. The Town Council would be the final deciding body. The alcoholic beverage policy gives the hearing body discretion to approve alcoholic beverage service when the proposal will not negatively impact the residential neighborhoods, alcohol-related incidents will not occur, and when the application will provide a positive impact to the commercial area. Based on the evidence submitted by the applicant, the discretionary privilege of alcohol service may be acceptable in this case. The proposed business meets parking requirements and does not create any traffic impacts. The applicants conducted outreach to the local neighborhood as well as local businesses. The applicants prepared and circulated 60 outreach packets. At this time, the town has received 9 public comments, all in support of the proposal. 5 are contained in the desk item. This concludes staff presentation, and staff is available for any questions.
Are there questions? Yes, Commissioner Bourgeois.
Thank you for the staff report. A couple clarifications. One, just to be clear, this does not meet the town's definition of a standalone bar or restaurant because of the significant retail component?
Correct, as well as the education wine classes.
And I know in a lot of the ABC applications we get, they're required to serve a meal with alcohol, but that's not the case here. Is that correct? They only have to have food available. Is that correct?
The alcoholic beverage policy speaks to restaurants without a separate bar and restaurants with a separate bar. And when they speak to these two type of restaurants, they speak to requiring meal service during alcohol beverage service. However, the alcohol beverage policy doesn't speak to this particular type of establishment where doesn't fit exactly into our definition of a restaurant, nor does it fit into the traditional definition of a bar. It's something that isn't quite defined in the alcohol beverage policy.
Okay, thank you.
Commissioner Erickson?
Thank you, Ms. Savage, for your report. Just to be sure I'm understanding carefully, the public comments that are received, none of the public comments have been from neighbors adjacent to the property. Is that correct?
I cannot confirm that statement, but I will look through them and let you know.
And there was another question, I think? Commissioner Telesfor?
Yeah, I just wanted to be clear about the alcohol policy. So what you really said was a long explanation. I really applaud you for it, but I sort of got lost. What you said was you can go into the establishment at this point and have a glass of wine, and you do not have to have food.
That's correct.
Thank you.
Not to beat a dead horse, but what I heard you say is we have a policy on bars and restaurants. We have essentially no policy on whatever this is because you don't know what it is. And therefore, sort of by inductive reasoning, it's up to us, except that it really is up to the town council. So we just don't have precedent, and we don't have a particular law that fits it.
That's correct.
That's what I was afraid of. Okay. Fortunately, we can do no harm tonight. The town council will be left with the decision. So, are there other questions? Is there a motion? We're still, I'm sorry, I've lost the applicant. Where is the applicant? We were so carried away there. Yes, please come forward and identify yourself and your address. I think good things are about to happen, but, you know.
Good evening, Commissioner. My name is Michael Guerra. I'm one of the applicants for the proposed project.
You want to tell us something, or you just want to answer questions?
I'm happy to answer questions. I think we pretty much submitted everything we could possibly submit here. I'm happy to clarify or do anything.
Okay. We have first Commissioner Jensen.
Yes.
Good evening. My question is based on the comments that have occurred here. You included, or we have included in our packet, a menu, a proposed menu for your establishment.
Right.
And it looks sort of like, I don't know, I would make a dinner of it. So my question is, when would you be planning to have that food available? Would it be at all the time that you're serving alcohol?
It would be.
Okay.
Yes.
Commissioner Telesfor.
This is a follow-up to that. I think this is Exhibit 4. I'm assuming that was something written by, I don't know if it was you, Mr. Guerra, or your partner. It's description of proposed project.
Uh-huh.
And in the third paragraph, the last line says, the food offerings shall be simple, easy to execute, and will not require any commercial equipment to prepare. And just to be sure, I just wanted to know then, because the follow-up question has to do with your menu.
Mm-hmm.
And I really am specifically referring to the entrees, which are breaded eggplant layered with tomato, basil, mozzarella, and parmigiana. It sounds very good. Boneless, skinless, grilled chicken breast, poached in wine, tomatoes, capers, lemon, and garlic. And I wanted to know, are you cooking that on a hot plate, or will that be, I mean, it sounds like it needs a little more preparation than like maybe you might need some commercial equipment. Is
Well,
the point. Could
correct.
you clarify that for
Sure.
us? Thank you.
We're going to try, and do not intend to have any kind of open flame stove. That's what we meant by commercial equipment. Our plan is to have maybe a convection oven and some equipment, a slicer to slice salamis and cheese and stuff like that. So anything that we can do, we're going to try and be creative to create some dishes from simple equipment. That's the intention.
Okay, so in other words, you wouldn't be having equipment that would require any special venting or
Exactly.
et cetera, et cetera.
Exactly.
And I'm sure if you did, you would be asked to go through those steps.
Absolutely.
Thank you. I just needed to clarify that. Thank you.
Commissioner Sayak?
I'm going to move away from the menu, although it's a great menu. Regarding public outreach, I do want to confirm that of the 60 packets you sent out, those packets did go out to the neighborhood behind your back parking lot, so?
Yes, we got a list of residences from the planning department and submitted packets to everyone on the list.
Okay, and to your knowledge, have any of the residential neighbors
We have not gotten
commented,
any.
both negative or
Yeah,
positive?
the letter that we submitted is in the packet that you have, and we asked folks to contact us with any questions, concerns, comments, and we have not heard a single thing from anybody from those packets.
Commissioner Erickson, did you have a question?
Thanks for your presentation, Mr. Rowe. It's terrific, and I think it would be a terrific addition to the town. When I reviewed the business plan, it's a classic, what I would call wine bar. So I have a later comment to the staff when we finish. But given that the business plan is heavy on the wine and is intending to do all the things that are laid out, is it really necessary, a necessary part of the business plan for you to serve beer as part of your offerings?
That's a good question. The reason, again, we operate a similar business we have for 6 years, and what we found was initially in that business we did not offer beer. But what we ended up seeing was a lot of customers coming in, husband and wife, a group of people. Not everybody drinks wine, and so we were frequently being asked, is there something else that I can have short of water and wine? And so we started to offer a small selection of bottled beer. And that's basically the intention here. Our intention is not to have a wide selection that you would see in a grocery store or in a traditional bar. It would be a handful of specialty beers, probably mostly Italian, because that's more or less the theme of the concept. But that's basically the reasoning behind that, is to just offer an alternative to people that don't drink wine.
Just in a quick follow-up question, the staff has recommended that in the first 2 years you not provide that what you characterize, and I've been to your other establishments, so the very limited beer service. So do you have an opinion about the staff's recommendation about that limitation?
Yes, thank you. I was actually going to ask if we understand the intent of that, and we're willing to cooperate with anything that helps us set ourselves apart from the traditional bar. That is not our intention. We are nothing like that. I would, however, ask, 2 years seemed a little bit of a long time. I was hoping to ask if it could be a year that we could set the review time and then see how we're doing versus 2 years, if we could shorten that time period.
These are things we'll consider when we close the public hearing.
Okay.
Commissioner Telesford, did you have a follow-up question?
I did. Thank you very much. My follow-up question really has to do with, and stay with me on this, but there are neighbors behind where you will be. And one of the issues in prior years to a restaurant and bar that were there was really the noise impact from bottles being, put somewhere in the back dumpster, and I don't know where the dumpster is for your bottles, but can you just go over quickly with us how you plan on getting rid of your wine bottles, and are we going to be having complaints about the noise that they make like we had before or not, or what's your plan for that? Can you?
That's not something that we've thought of. I think the dumpster is going to be behind the building, which would be closest to those, to the houses. I could, we're willing to cooperate and hold the bottle. I'm just thinking off the top of my head now, but if we hold the bottles somewhere in the back of the building and then empty them, the next day, we're willing to do that, whatever it takes us to be good neighbors to the residents that live next door.
Okay, were there other questions? Commissioner Bourgeois?
Yeah, I'm going to reach back and follow up on Commissioner Jensen's question about the food and alcohol service. Just to be clear, when looking at your hours of operation, your hours of alcohol service, it seems like the food service is going to continue an hour past the alcohol service?
No.
Is that correct? No.
No, food service and alcohol service will be the same, exactly.
Okay, so that last hour...
That last hour
is just retail?
Is just retail.
Okay,
and
great.
To allow people that have come in, close to the, it's almost like having a last call an hour before we close, just to allow people to linger and finish
okay.
What they're eating and drinking.
Great. Thank you for clarifying.
Are there other questions? Thank you very much.
My pleasure.
I have one card from Craig Sawyer. Mr. Sawyer.
Good evening. My name is Craig Sawyer. I live at 63 Highland Avenue, which is more or less catty corner behind this building. I've known these applicants for many years in two previous businesses they've been involved in. I've bought their wine based on their recommendations. I've attended wine functions that they've sponsored and learned a lot in the process, particularly Italian wines. They know their wine, and they operate their business with the highest integrity, in my opinion. I'm happy to see an old world style Enoteca come to Los Gatos, and I hope that you look favorably on this application. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Just one second. Are there any questions of the speaker? Thank you again. Okay. The applicant can stand up and say something if you wish to, or say nothing. All right. So there are no other cards. I will close the public hearing, as I tried to do some time ago, and ask if there's any discussion. Yes, Commissioner Sayre.
I do have a question of staff. There was the request from the applicant of a one-year administrative versus 2, and so I would like to hear staff's opinion on that subject.
If staff would be amenable to that change, we would just need the Planning Commission to recommend change the condition as they go to Town Council.
Commissioner Erickson?
Yes, I have a follow-up question to that. Is it really necessary to have any period? Or if it's either part of it either be part of the business or it won't be. It seems to me it'll either be part of the business or not a part of the business, and it either is a risk that we're not willing to take, so we would want to put a condition on the conditional use permit that they weren't allowed to serve beer, or to let them serve beer on the first day. I mean, given their business plan, one could argue that you wouldn't want to allow them to offer or serve beer, and if we think there's a significant risk, why would we ever want to do it? But given both their business plan and their response to it, their intent is to serve it on a very limited basis, so it seems to me not the risk, and it's clearly doesn't meet, doesn't seem like to me, the definition of a bar. In fact, I would encourage the planning director to communicate with the town manager for the town council to consider amending the alcohol policy to introduce what are conventionally called wine bars as another category. So we're kind of in between. But this is not a bar by its nature, and so I'm not sure why it's necessary to limit the service of alcohol of beer at all, given that it's clearly not a bar and doesn't meet the limitations. Maybe. Opinion.
Commissioner Jensen.
I agree with Commissioner Erickson. I really can't find any reason, if we're going to consider granting service of wine, not to grant service of beer. It doesn't make sense to me for the distinction.
Commissioner Bourgeois.
I agree, and I actually think there's more to be gained from the review period if we give them a chance to serve it, and then we see if it's working. I mean, if they're not doing it in review, I don't know what we actually gain by having that review period. So I would be in favor of that as well.
Are there other comments? Commissioner Telesfor.
Right. I would probably agree with my fellow commissioners, but I do have a question of staff about, and that is just about how could we develop some kind of a bottle noise prevention, I don't even know what you would call that, system, because I am concerned about that just because of prior.
Before you answer that question, let's maybe somebody can tell us, but you may recall the problem we had before was with a bar that closed, as I recall, at 2 a.m., and I'm not so sure that the problem wasn't occurring considerably after 10 o'clock at night. And also, I don't recall, being too young to drink, whether bars have to break bottles that are not beer but are hard alcohol. They used to do that. I don't know if they still do it. But in any event, I just want to make sure we keep in our mind that the particular bar you have in reference, I think, had much different problems and much different hours. But I think your suggestion is correct, that we could ask staff to look into having them dispose of these bottles. If they're going to stop serving alcohol, for example, at 10, they could dispose of the bottles at 10. And secondly, they sound like very reasonable people. We could have them tell us how they're going to dispose of them to keep the noise down. It doesn't sound like too hard. So I think you're right. Your idea is right, but I just don't want to compare these people to the bar.
No. But it did remind me of bottle noise, and I know what that sounds like. And even when I do it in my own, I don't do it. I never drink.
Confessions are not necessary.
I know. Excuse me. Anyway, so thank you, Commissioner. Going.
All right. Now, let me just say on that one point, I don't have a problem with what people are saying. It just seemed to me the staff was really saying, one, this seems to be a different animal than we're normally dealing with, and they're perfectly willing to say, you know, let's go for it. You don't have to serve a meal with the wine, which I think is probably a good idea, to say what you're saying on that point. And then they said, well, let's see how they do. And that was the 2-year thing. And then I think the idea of 1 year, and they said, well, 1 year. In fact, they're the ones that asked for 1 year. Then I also heard a suggestion that instead of making it what a lawyer would call a condition precedent, in other words, if you go for 2 years and everything's fine, then you get the beer. Somebody wants to do it, so it's like a subsequent thing. You can have beer unless within X number of whatever you get. It's much harder to take things away from people than it is to give things to people. Unfortunately, we don't have the town attorney here, but for whatever it's worth, my experience is people get things, and it's very hard to make them let go. So if there's, I don't think we have any concern about this applicant. But on the other hand, and I will look to the town to tell me, if they have a feeling based on their experience that it's a good thing to find things out first, and there's no magic to 1 year or 6 months, and I agree that 2 years is too long. So I would just ask staff if you could help us, because, you know, it isn't readily apparent to me that Commissioner Erickson's point is not well taken.
I think this is good discussion. The staff, given the history of our alcohol policy and some concerns raised in the community, we were taking a very conservative approach. I think that you could structure it such that we could do an administrative review, allow them at the onset to fulfill their business plan, and then we could conduct a 2-year administrative review to make sure that everything is meeting the conditions of approval of the conditional use permit. That's one way you can handle it. I think the other way you can handle is make a recommendation to the council that you feel that the restriction or phasing in, shall we say, of beer service is not necessary, and you would recommend that that be allowed at the commencement of the operation. So I think those are two different ways you can handle it. I think either way, staff is fine with that either way. Again, we're just taking a more conservative role in this. And by the way, we are looking at the alcohol policy to see how we can define this.
Commissioner Jensen.
In support of what Commissioner Erickson had said regarding allowing beer at the outset, and I support that, one of the points that the staff made in its report to us was that the other business that the applicant runs has had no complaints for 6 years, so I think that's a pretty strong reason to take a risk.
Well, are we ready for a motion? It sure sounds like it. Can we have a motion? Commissioner Bourgeois seems to be willing to do this.
I was going to defer to Commissioner Erickson, but I'm happy to jump in here. All right. So I am going to move that we recommend approval of the conditional use permit application U-09-005 to the Town Council with the conditions contained in Exhibit 3. To make that approval, I can find that the proposed project is categorically exempt pursuant to Section 15301 of the CEQA guidelines, that I can make the findings required in Section 2920-190 of the Town Code for granting approval of the conditional use permit, and that it is consistent with the redevelopment plan for the Central Los Gatos project, as it meets the uses set forth in the town's general plan. And to that, I would like to amend the conditions so that it allows beer service from the onset.
Take that one out there.
Yes. And 3 and 13. And 13 would be so condition 3.
3 would be modified. 13 would be eliminated.
Right. No, I would like to keep 13. I would like to keep 13 in there.
Okay,
We still
so
have
keep the review.
Still have the
Okay.
review at year 2. Yeah.
Okay.
So, yeah, and then condition 3 would be modified.
To start immediately. Then.
To start immediately, correct. Okay. But 13 would remain. Okay, that's my motion.
Is there a second? Commissioner Jensen. Is there a discussion?
I will
Commissioner
support
Telesco.
that, and I'll support the recommendation to commence the beer service with the opening of the business because of the explanation from the applicant. I thought it was thoughtful and didn't seem to be just, well, because I want to, so.
Any further discussion? Commissioner Erickson.
Just a question of clarification of the staff. So assuming we leave the 2-year review in, the review wouldn't specifically focus on the service of beer, right? It would just focus on whether they were meeting the condition, discharging their responsibilities on the condition, under the conditional use permit in general, correct?
Correct.
Okay.
Is everyone clear now on the motion? All those in favor, say aye. Aye.
Aye.
Anyone opposed? 1 abstention. Thank you very much. All right, we can go now to item 2, which is the zoning ordinance amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And we are going to be pulling up a PowerPoint presentation, and no one's going to be here to watch it except us.
You are really an interesting person.
I know, my first presentation. I'm not feeling the love.
We love you.
Okay.
You had it in the right order in the first place.
Oh, no, this is the best way to go.
Well, I will, because we don't have any public members, maybe we do on the monitor, on the TV, but I will go through this rather quickly then. You do have a copy of the presentation, and I would not be, it's fine with me if you want to just look at that rather than looking at the presentation here. I think it always helps to be able to mark notes on it as you're going through it. But in 2008, there's two events that really that spurred us to take a look at this, the BMP program. The first was in 2008 when the Bay Tree condominium conversion project, the PD, was approved, which you saw the Arkansas site and subdivision tonight. That project required some changes to the BMP program as it was back in 2008. During that same time period, many of you may have seen the the Los Gatos Meadows Senior Living Facility presentation. One of the issues that was raised was the concern of trying to incorporate a BMP into their business plan. As you know, they're a continuum care facility, and it's very difficult to have that a unit follow someone in there as they go through levels of care. So the Town Council directed staff to make a number of changes to the BMP program. And it's working. Okay. The proposed amendments are intended to first allow exceptions to the eligibility requirements for people residing in apartments that are converting to condominiums. So it's only in the case of people in a condominium conversion project. To also allow flexibility in phasing requirements for applications that are processed as a planned development application. Allow BMP units to be provided off-site if authorized by the Town Council for continuum care facilities, and to clean up some of the existing language. Let's go through those independently, though, and I can explain the rationale and how that was addressed. So providing off-site construction provision for continuum care facilities. As you know, residents of these types of facilities do go through a level of care. They may start off independent living, then they may progress to maybe more assisted care, maybe an Alzheimer's center. So it's very difficult to have a BMP unit continue with them. So the recommendation then was to just allow that for, allow a continuum care facility to do an off-site facility. Also to provide phasing for BMP units in projects that are converting to apartment complexes. This would apply when the unit is the unit that is proposed as the BMP has a tenant that's living in it, and that it prior to it being converted, that they would have to meet certain other requirements, but also there would be exceptions made to them being able to be a buyer of that unit and qualify for that unit. And also provide an exception for the first-time home buyers qualification requirements for tenants who are residing in an apartment that again is converted to a condominium unit. To again allow for this unique situation where you have existing tenants and that you do not want to evict them from that and give them the opportunity to be able to stay in that unit. Now, during the review of this program modification, we took this to the General Plan Committee, and they spent actually, I think, two to three meetings on it. And they had some additional changes that they had recommended. The first was to include a new provision that requires owners to occupy their BMP unit rather than renting it. At the time when staff was working with the GPC, we were not aware, because this program is actually administered by our department as well as community services, and so we didn't have that community services knowledge, where we found out that we already have provisions that address this, that they have to occupy their units. First off, we have the Santa Clara County Housing Authority that does all of our eligibility and our validation or verification that continue as the people are living there, that they continue to meet those qualifications. We also have deed restrictions that are recorded on the property that requires the owner to live there. The GPC also recommended to prohibit an owner-occupied BMP unit recipient from upgrading to a larger unit. The concern was that they felt that that a recipient is fortunate to be able to get into a unit, and that they should be satisfied with that and not be able to move up in a unit. And there was some debate over that, whether it made sense to allow, as maybe families grow, allow them to move into a larger unit. However, the one thing that we didn't talk about was the fact that this is a first-time home buyers program. So by that very nature, it would prohibit somebody from moving up to another unit because they would no longer be a first-time home buyer. Definition by our BMP guidelines of a first-time home buyer is that you cannot be on a residential title within the 9 Bay Area counties within the past 3 years. So that would eliminate a person from being able to upgrade. Now, there were two other recommendations from the General Plan Committee, and these are more policy-related issues. The first was to eliminate in lieu fee option for smaller residential projects of 5 to 9 units. Currently, we allow an applicant to either provide the unit or to do an in lieu fee for that. We round up our units if it's greater than 0.5, it'd be rounded up to the next whole. So for a 5 to 9 unit project, you'd be required to provide 1 BMP unit. So we either, right now, allow you to construct that unit on site, or we have you pay an in lieu fee. That's the option of the developer. The GPC felt that because of the, and I'm going to get into it a little bit more in detail, so let me just summarize the other one, then we'll go more in detail. The GPC also recommend eliminating the in lieu fee option for projects that are 5 units or more in the hillside area. And again, I think the overall purpose of this program is to create units that are interspersed within market rate projects throughout the community, and having those units on site. So the GPC felt that it was important that those units be developed on site. The hillsides makes another case or another issue. So let's take a look at that. This isn't really responding fast enough. It must be tired too. So focusing on these latter two issues, again, staff felt that the GPC's recommendation for eliminating in lieu fee options for 5 to 9 units in non-hillside areas makes sense. It's consistent with the program objectives, and if it's a tight site, then possibly the applicant just eliminates one of their market rate units and does 8 market rate units and 1 BMP. However, when we looked at the proposal to eliminate that in the hillside area, we thought it was important to go ahead and do a little homework on that and see how other jurisdictions are treating that, and how prevalent is in the inclusionary housing programs, whether in lieu fees are allowed for hillside developments. As we know, there's good rationale why we wanted to do the in lieu fee in the hillside areas. We want to reduce our densities there. We don't want a lot of development intensity, so it made sense to do the in lieu fees. But as we start to look at it and start to think of changing that, we want to make sure that we're changing that with a lot of information behind that. So in the time between GPC last seeing this and now, we were able to do a little bit of homework, and your staff report summarizes that homework. I think it's really important to note, though, that the GPC did not have this information with them when we, so they didn't really have the basis of this information to help make that decision. So in focusing on the research that we looked at, the town does have full discretion administering the BMP program. This is not something that's required by the state, so we have full discretion with that. Staff wanted to see how other cities are handling these programs, administering these programs. So we surveyed 8 jurisdictions within our general area, mostly Santa Clara County, to ascertain their relevant policies on in lieu fees and off-site construction. Of the 8 jurisdictions that we surveyed, all contained an in lieu fee alternative to provide the BMP unit, and 5 out of the 8 allowed for off-site construction to meet these requirements. The in lieu fee option generally applies to smaller development projects, and in most cases the city council or city staff is the approving body for it. It's not just the applicant's desire that the city or town has to approve that. We also consulted a publication that was put out by the California Coalition for Rural Housing entitled Inclusionary Housing in California, 30 Years of Innovation. And in that there was 107 California jurisdictions with inclusionary housing programs, and most offered developer alternatives to constructing the affordable units within the market rate project. Most common was in lieu fees, and constructing that, or paying in lieu fees rather than constructing the units. Of the 81% of the reporting programs that provided an in lieu fee option, only 45% were automatic, and 55% required the developer provide or prove that the on-site construction was infeasible. And just for the Planning Commission's background, when the GPC was looking at this, we looked at whether we could come up with criteria to determine whether it's feasible or infeasible. It's very hard to come up with that kind of criteria. We tried to tie it back into specific plans or to master plans, and pretty much if you say that that the criteria would apply to one case, it's really going to apply to every case. And so it was really difficult to discern between that. Finally, 67% of the surveyed jurisdictions permit developers to construct units at off-site locations. Now, we also thought it was important to look at how we've been utilizing our BMP program funds. So, since 1993, when the funds were established, we have generated approximately $1.8 million in payment into the BMP funds. The fund has been principally used to buy units that are at risk of losing their affordability, and then we often turn around and sell those again with affordability restriction on them, a longer affordability restriction. And we've also used it for administrative costs, principally our contract with the Housing Authority. We don't really have a lot of administrative costs with this because this project or this program is administered by our Community Services department right now. It will be transferring to community development, and we have probably about a 0.2 FTE that's actually assigned to this. At the end of 07-08, the fund had a balance of approximately $1.4 million.
Let me just ask you a question there.
Sure.
Does that mean we've only spent $400,000 of the 1.8 since?
Well, I mean, that's how it looks, but if you look at, when I looked at the actual counting of the funds, so you have maybe, originally we had, funds built up to about 1.8, then we may go and buy an at-risk unit, so it drops down to maybe, 800,000, 700,000, and then we'd have a subdivision that was approved, and as those units were constructed, we'd have funds coming back into the account. So it hasn't consistently maintained that balance. It just so happens that we bought a number of units and we sold them back. One of the units we actually lost money on, but again, we're still trying to achieve the affordability, and it ended up being put into the affordable program. So in the end, we're still meeting our program goals. But so the fund balance, it varies depending on what's happening.
If I could follow up on that. So looking at how the money's been spent, it seems like it's largely been to retain existing affordable units and not necessarily the creation of any new affordable units.
It has not been used to create any new units,
Okay.
correct.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Sorry, I don't have my glasses on, so I'm having a hard time seeing which slide that is. Okay, we're on the next slide. Also, the recently prepared Affordable Housing Strategies has identified several housing programs as well as new programs for the town to pursue with the BMP and the RDA housing funds. So we feel that the $1.4 million that's currently in there with money coming in, we're having some subdivisions building out, Foster Road, I believe it is, that's contributing to it right now. So we anticipate, as the GPC saw with the Affordable Housing Strategies, that we'll be funding some of our existing programs as well as new programs, including the Housing Trust, the Santa Clara County Housing Trust, the First-Time Home Buyer Program, Housing Conservation, creating a Property Acquisition Fund, are some of the things that we'll be pursuing. Our Affordable Housing Strategies also recommends that we look at leveraging our BMP funds as well as our RDA funds and maybe bonding for our total capacity of our RDA funds. So we may have some significant funds, like around $18 million, to be able to do some affordable housing projects. So having that BMP money is helpful. Okay. Two additional final factors to consider when determining whether to eliminate the AMUFI option. The first is how would the town respond to a case where a developer could not find the appropriate priced unit to buy? Right now, the formula for what a developer has to pay as the AMUFI is 6% of the building valuation for all the units in the subdivision. So let's say it's a 5-unit subdivision. So the overall fee would be 6% of the building valuation for each of those units. And I'll just give you an idea. Foster Road, I think there are fairly expensive homes that are being built there, but those per unit, 6% is calculating out to about $100,000. So I'm not sure. I think that's about a 7 or 8 unit subdivision. So we're roughly generating about $700,000 or $800,000. Now, you're probably going to be able to go out and buy a unit for that or build a unit for that. However, in a more modest subdivision, it may be difficult. You may see housing values that are much less, and I'm not sure what those homes are going for, but I'm going to guess they're probably in the $2 to $3 million range. If you have something more modest, you may only generate half that, and then it may be difficult to find a unit at that price. I think more importantly is if by chance the developer decides to buy a unit in town rather than building a unit, which most likely they would if it's just one unit, what is the town's responsibility in notifying those existing probably market rate unit owners, and that one of the units may no longer be a market rate unit, it'd be a subsidized unit? You know, it does create concerns, and we would have to determine what role the town has in that, and what role the developer has in that, and what type of noticing and what type of requirements we have for working with the tenants or owners in this case, most likely. So staff has found that the new programs are very common, especially with smaller residential developments. While most jurisdictions prefer to integrate the affordable and market rate units, off-site construction is often allowed if it can be demonstrated that greater community benefits can be achieved with an off-site alternative. However, it's important to consider how that off-site unit is integrated into the neighborhood, especially if it's an existing market rate project and a market rate unit that's being converted to a BMP. The in lieu fee program has generated a fairly significant amount of funds over the past 16 years. While the BMP fund has not directly been used to construct any new units, as we've discussed, it has provided funding to maintain existing affordable units, program administrative costs, program monitoring, and BMP eligibility verifications. So based on both the benefits of the in lieu fee and the possible aforementioned problems associated with off-site construction or conversion, and the fact that the in lieu fee options are commonly used throughout jurisdictions, staff would recommend this option for residential developments, recommend continuing the in lieu option for Hillside Residential. And again, I do need to stress the GPC did not have the benefit of this information when they were making that recommendation. Now, last Thursday, we met with the Community Services Commission, and they reviewed the draft program revisions, and they generally found that the program revisions were acceptable. They did have a concern with the recommended exception to the first-time home buyer program. As this is structured right now, if you have a tenant in a condo conversion, and that unit's going to become a BMP unit, then it's suggested that they have to meet the eligibility requirements, of course, but that they don't have to meet the requirements that they are not, right now, that they are a first-time home buyer. So in other words, not have owned property in the 9 Bay Area counties in the last 3 years. And so because this was a unique situation, it was recommended that they not have to meet that requirement. It was also recommended that they not have to, that they would have the first right of refusal. The Community Service Commission had a concern with that, but they did recognize this is a unique situation, and so they had recommended that it not be waived, that they still have to meet an eligibility requirement on income, but they felt that it could be reduced to 2 years and not a 3-year. So in other words, if they were a homeowner within the last, say 3 years ago, they would still be qualified up till 2 years ago. And that's where they have a concern was at. And they wanted to draw that line at 2 years. So that was their recommendation. They also recommended that the town attorney review the proposed exceptions to ensure that there are not any fairness concerns or liability issues. So in essence, they felt that there should not be the exception to the buyer, first-time home buyer. They just felt reducing the requirements by 1 year would be satisfactory. Any questions on that? That was, and you didn't have, that was in your report because we just met with them last Thursday. Yes?
Yes, please.
So I have a question about the first-time home buyers, the exception. Is my understanding that if an apartment complex is going into conversion, they have to notify the tenants of that intent?
Correct.
And so, say someone in good faith rents an apartment, a week later they get notified it's being converted. They're going to be in a different situation than someone who goes into, now if the conversion process is in place, someone renting an apartment is going to know that up front. Like when they go in to rent, they're going to be notified right then and there.
If it's in progress.
Progress,
Yes.
right. So are we making a distinction between those two
We did.
individuals?
We had suggested, staff had suggested that when the notice of intent to convert, which is the very first step in a condo conversion, is issued to the tenants, which probably from the time it's approved is roughly 2 years, I would guess. When that notice goes out, that would be the threshold. Anyone moving in after that time would not be eligible then to have the exception to the first-time home buyer. But anyone prior to that point, in other words, they conceivably would not have knowledge that that was going to occur. So that's what we added in, and that's it's in the guidelines section.
But just to be clear on that point, the 2-year thing that we just talked about would not apply there in that situation that Commissioner Bourgeois is raising.
What the Community Service Commission is recommending right now, the first-time home buyer.
No, the hypothetical he gives us, though, is let's assume somebody sells their house. They move into this apartment complex. A week after they move in, the thing is filed.
Mm-hmm.
Now, of course, these people have owned the home within 2 years.
Correct.
So it doesn't seem quite fair to apply it to them.
Well, and that's, I think, what the Community Service Commission felt, that if they owned a home within, and they reduced it by a year. Right now, our definition of first-time home buyer is that you haven't owned a home within the last 3 years. Or you haven't been on title of a home in the 9 Bay Area counties in the last 3 years. The Community Service Commission did not feel that that it really warranted allowing these tenants to have a complete exception from that, but they felt it was unique enough to give them some compensation, and so they felt that 2 years was acceptable. So they reduced the eligibility requirements by 1 year, in essence.
Yes, Commissioner.
I would just like to say, I think, I appreciate the concern from the Community Services Commission. I understand that perspective, but I think granting the exception, I remember the conversations we had at GPC, and I'm in favor of just granting the exception. I think there's too many extenuating circumstances in people's lives to try and put a number on it. And I think if they've downsized to an apartment for some reason, and I don't think we can make any judgments as to how or why or if or when. So I would be in favor of just granting the exception. If they come in before the notice of intent to convert, I'm in favor of granting the exception.
I would agree with that. We're just getting a sense here at the moment.
Right.
It looks like, does somebody disagree with that? Okay, so none of it, I guess you can say we all agree with that.
Good. And just to complete our summary, there was also a number of staff recommended changes, and they're really minor. We just reformat the guidelines to make them more user-friendly, add a purpose statement and enabling legislation statement. We are adding a requirement for a affordability agreement that just protects the town, that the affordability agreement would be required on the property and recorded on the property. And then also we made some small changes to clarify existing procedures. So the attached guidelines and ordinance, we feel, reflect all council direction. They reflect the GPC recommended changes, including the suggested elimination of the AMU fee option for 5 units or more projects in the hillside residential zone. So we did include that because that was the GPC's recommendation. And staff, and it also includes staff recommended changes. We have not made the changes that the Community Services Commission had recommended because, again, the short timeline between those two projects or two presentations. So the two outstanding issues for the Planning Commission to consider in their recommendation to the Town Council is, again, whether to eliminate the AMU fee option for projects that are 5 units or more within the hillside residential zone designation, and to and if a tenant in a condominium conversion project that's going to be converted should be granted the exception from the first-time home buyer process. So with that, we are recommending your input on those two items, and then recommending that you forward this to the draft ordinance and draft resolution to the Town Council with a recommendation of approval.
We've already spoken on the second item, I would say, so I think we have really one item.
Mm-hmm.
So if anybody wants to talk about that item, yes, we do have people wanting to talk. I think Commissioner Jensen I saw first, so we'll start with you.
I really have a question, I guess, and then comment. I'm looking at page 3 of 6 on the proposed draft.
On the staff report or the guidelines?
That's not the PowerPoint, the staff report?
The staff report, okay.
The striking in red, and it's at 3 of 6.
And did you get a colored copy? Because I realized I didn't. Oh, okay.
Mine is colored, yeah.
Good.
Below market price program requirements shall apply to all residential development projects that include 5 or more residential units. And then I'm going down to, it says, planned development with an underlying zone of HR shall only be required to pay an in lieu fee as established by separate resolution. I don't understand what you mean by that.
I'm sorry, and I'm still trying to
in the middle
track
of
where
the
you are.
page on 3 of 6, Division 6 Housing Assistance Program. What is it?
This is in the ordinance.
Oh, okay. I was on the...
On the ordinance, yeah.
Okay.
On the ordinance? I'm sorry.
That's okay.
The proposed ordinance?
And...
Attachment 2.
Right. I've got that now. And so your question was...
Page 3 of 6?
Got that. So plan development...
It's in red. In the middle, plan development with an underlying zone of HR shall only be required to pay an in lieu fee.
I'm sorry. I thought that we did strike that. We did strike it in the guidelines, but we didn't strike it here.
But it didn't make sense to me. Okay,
Yeah.
so that should
That
not
should
be
be
there.
strike.
Okay.
Yeah. Struck.
Struck. Okay.
Strike through. Presently, as based on GPC's recommendation.
But that gets us to the area we're supposed to talk about.
Correct.
So are there other questions before we get to the one issue that we have remaining? Commissioner Sayar.
Okay. Before we move away from the conversion of apartments to condominiums, I do want to clarify, all eligibility requirements would have to be met by those currently renting an apartment that would be converted, except for the first-time home buyer.
Right. The only other eligibility requirement is income,
Okay.
and that would be required, yes.
And then the other clarification I have with this in lieu, it only applies to the hillside residential zone?
Presently, it applies to all projects 5 to 9 units, hillside and non-hillside.
And the recommended changes that staff is proposing is just for the hillside residential?
Just to allow the in lieu fee for, continue to allow the in lieu fee for hillside,
Whereas the 5 to 9 units on
non-hillside, yeah.
would be, the proposal is to keep that, the BMP units interspersed within that development.
Correct, to actually eliminate the in lieu fee option for those projects.
Okay, great, thank you.
Let me just see if I understood the answer. You said for the flat, what we'll call flatland projects, to eliminate?
Eliminate the in lieu fee option.
Oh, okay, fine.
Yeah.
Now I do understand. Oh, okay. Commissioner Talaspour?
Yeah, I had a question, maybe we've talked about it and I missed it, but it's of the staff report, page 3, under the General Plan Committee recommended changes. And I know this isn't what we're to make a decision on, but I honestly wanted the rationale explained to me more on this, I guess. To prohibit the owner-occupied BMP unit recipients from upgrading to a larger or newer BMP unit. Okay, there's that's one question, but the other thing is, how about if the owner-occupied BMP unit recipient wanted to downgrade to a smaller? Can you discuss that and the
Sure.
rationale behind it?
I think the GPC's concern was upgrading to another unit. And then I'm not sure if it was more based upon upgrading to a larger unit or just a newer unit. But in either of those cases, either upgrading or downgrading, let's say, in both those cases, you would not be eligible because you would be a homeowner at that point. This is all for home ownership, and so you would not meet the eligibility requirements of being a first-time home buyer. So you would be prohibited from doing that because you wouldn't meet the eligibility requirements.
Okay.
Unless you were there longer than 3 years.
No, unless you didn't have residency for 3 years there, or you weren't on title for 3 years. The intent, if you go back to the intent of inclusionary housing programs. They're really looked as helping people get that first start and get into that first unit. Then it's perceived or theorized that they build up equity, they build up their resources, and then they can move on to a non-subsidized housing unit. So you're really trying to keep those units in that market where it's really needed most. And so I think that these go back, 16 years, but I'm going to guess that's the rationale because that makes most intuitive sense to me.
And I certainly understand that because it certainly acts as an incentive, but in some ways, it almost de-incentives, I don't even know the word for it, but
disincentive.
Someone discourages in a very meaningful way. Our lives aren't always so black and white, and changes happen, and so I'm concerned.
But it has nothing to do. The concept is, are you a first-time buyer? Nothing to do with your life except are you a first-time buyer? And if you want to get into your story of your life and bad things happen to you and all that kind of stuff, the only issue is, are you a first-time buyer? And if you're a first-time buyer, you get this program, you got the deal. Now, if you want to change it and you're no longer a first-time buyer, you haven't been misled, you haven't been lied. If you're saying, oh, by golly, it was a hardship occurred, well, that's right, and maybe there's some other program for your hardship, but it isn't this program.
And one other option or one other thought to consider is that if somebody really did want to move up, let's say they did, have a family and they want to move up, then they sell their unit and they rent for 3 years and then they're eligible to reapply to the program again. So it's not eliminating that option forever. I think what it's really geared as just is trying to be able to provide those units to the people that need them the most.
Commissioner Sayoc.
Actually, the clarification you just provided was very helpful. If a person who does own a BMP, sold it, rented it, there's nothing that would prevent them from in the future, as long as they did not own a home for 3 years, to come back to a BMP unit.
Yes, correct. They still have to go, there's a rating system that they'd have to, they get extra points if they live in town, they get extra points if they work in town, they get extra points, I can't remember all the different criteria, it's in the guidelines, but they, so they would have to build up their points to be able to rise to the top, but yes.
There's nothing that eliminates
prohibits,
points
right.
Because they've utilized this program in the past. Okay, thank you.
Other questions? Yes, Commissioner Bourgeois.
I was going to move on to the in lieu fee in the hillsides. And I appreciate all the additional information. One thing I'm having trouble with understanding is, the discussion at the GPC was we want the units built.
Correct.
And we want them spread out through town. We don't want them consolidated into a certain area. We want them mixed in with market rate housing. So it seems like we jumped pretty quickly to, off-site has its problems and we should do in lieu fees. Is the problem with on-site in the hillsides simply the density in the hillsides? Is that the main concern?
That is my understanding, that the main concern was to trying to keep densities down, intensity down in the hillsides, so that that's why the in lieu fee option was provided.
Okay.
Is it also, my experience, I guess, is that, we've had exceptions. We've had several developments in what I would call hillsides, and by developments, I mean really essentially more than 6 at least. We can think of those. So I guess the issue we're dealing with is, let's assume I want to build or have 10 lots in an area, and so using the 6% rule, I don't know what that comes out to, but if we assume for the moment, which is not far-fetched, that each of the lots is $1 million, so you got $10 million and you're applying the 6% rule to that, which is $600,000, I think. You're not going to be able to buy a house in that subdivision, because if the lot cost $1 million, you aren't going to get a house. So I did note that some of these jurisdictions that use this say, well, you got to show us why it isn't going to work, and if you show us why it isn't going to work, then we can use the fee in lieu.
Correct.
So that seems reasonable. I mean, if you say, well, it would work, then I would agree that our plan is let's get a real house there, as opposed to let's get money, because money is much more difficult to get houses out of. But if it's clear that in that development it just doesn't pencil out, then I would think that the jurisdictions that say, well, okay, the burden is on the developer to prove to us why it's not going to work, and if the developer does prove to us why it's not going to work, then either an in lieu fee could be used or the purchase of a house. But he's going to have the same problem, I think. But you could do it in the two-step thing. You could say, well, go buy a house, but if you can show us to why you can't buy a house, i.e. $600,000, let's just say, is not enough. I think that's probably not the case anymore. But I would not have a problem with an in lieu fee if someone could show us why it wouldn't work in the hillsides. But then you still have the two follow-on questions. Does that mean they go buy a house? Or if they could show us why they can't do that, then and only then do they get the in lieu. So that's something we can talk about.
And if you remember, the Plan Commission members who are also General Plan Committee members, we had a little bit of that discussion. I think when we first, probably in the beginning of July, brought that suggestion to you, the GPC had asked us to develop some criteria for determining when you should allow the in lieu fee option versus requiring the unit to be built. And staff went back and we looked at certain criteria and tried to come up with something that could be unique, because you don't want to be able to necessarily grant to everybody. You have to come up with that unique situation. It was very difficult to come up with something that everyone couldn't say the same thing. I think we had recommended that that the applicant would have to provide a financial analysis of indicating why an off-site location was more feasible than an on-site location. We can go back to that. There are jurisdictions. I am reading, as we were developing these changes to the guidelines, I was reading Mountain Views, and they actually have a provision that if the units are over $400,000, then you can pay an in lieu fee rather than constructing the units. So other jurisdictions are responding to that. I think that's a fairly low amount, but other jurisdictions are responding in that way, and that's something that we can do. Still allow the in lieu fee option at the discretion of the town council, but that the developer has to prove why they need to pay the in lieu fee.
Well, I question whether it's at the discretion. If the developer proves why he can't do it, where is the discretion? I mean, the discretion would be believing, I suppose. You have to make a finding that the guy has established that it can't be done. Then there's no more discretion. If it can't be done, it can't be done. So I think, Commissioner Erickson, you were going to say something?
Well, I guess the staff report says the presumed concern in the hillside is not based on whether it pencils out financially, which is what this discussion is about, but talks about the presumed concern was about density. So that's not obvious to me why an in lieu fee would necessarily address density issues unless one is presuming, if I have Chairman O'Donnell's example of development, that I could, if I included a below market price house in that I could develop 11 rather than 10, therefore I would increase the density. So it seems to me there's two different rationale going on here that are different. So which of the two discussions are we attempting to address with the in lieu fee, the density issue or the financial issue for the developer of the property?
When just talking to staff, because no one really has the knowledge of it's just the assumption of staff. No one has the historical knowledge to know why that was put in as it was. But it's just knowing our overall goals for planning in the community is to really try to reduce the density in the hillside. That was our assumption. But it could have very well been a financial assumption. But given the fact these go back 16 years or so, that may not be as an important consideration back then as I think density in the hillsides probably was.
Well, wouldn't we deal with both, though, really? I mean, you can say our goal is to keep the hillsides as free as we can, and that certainly is a goal, and that gets into the in lieu fee thing. But even if you say and, as opposed to or, if you say and, if it can also be shown that you couldn't do it anyway, I mean, if it's just a foregone conclusion that we don't want to give the density bonus, so to speak, we just don't want to do that. So that's easy. But you still have got, I guess the question then still becomes, do you go buy a unit in the community that isn't in the hillside? Or do you get to do it in lieu fee? You still have that question that comes up.
Correct.
So I agree with you that if the policy is we want to discourage increasing density in the hillside, then you say on the hillsides, on the 5 to 9, you can accept an in lieu. But does that leave it up to the developer? The developer says, well, I don't care about density. Let's put another house in there.
The way that they're structured right now, it's an option.
And it doesn't get to the town's policy, does it? Commissioner Sayre.
I think it's an option that, from my review of the transactions that have occurred, the deposits made into the fund, and it's an option that's used heavily, I think. And remember, this only applies to PDs, to planned development. So that's important to because if you have a 5-lot subdivision that meets all development standards, they're not required to provide the BMP. It's only when it's a planned development.
That's really narrows it down. Commissioner Erickson? Or Commissioner Sack, you have a pending question? I'm sorry.
I did, and then your comment just made me think of other things. But right now, as it stands, is there a preference directed by the council or whether it's the council or the affordable housing strategy that's currently being worked on, having actual units purchased, or is the goal to actually beef up this fund that we have so that a future strategy of buying homes would be more affordable? Where are we right now? And
I can't answer that because I don't have the history to be able to comment on what I think the council's goal is. I could just tell you the overall goal of the program is to produce as many units as you can.
And at the General Plan Committee, and Commissioner Bourgeois or Commissioner Jensen can correct me, my impression from certainly the two council people present was it was to acquire actual units.
Mm-hmm.
It was like, we're getting tired of this, putting money in the bank and not getting units as such. So,
which is one of the reasons we did the affordable housing strategies exercise, was because of our fund balances were fairly high, especially with our RDA funds.
So, but all we're talking about at the moment is this, I think, this one narrow area. So I just wanted us to focus on that. But go ahead, Commissioner Sack. I'm sorry.
Oh, no, but along those lines of that narrow area, assuming this does pass, does that then, we're talking about the discretion, whether it's council or city staff or town staff, of directing whether it's an in lieu or off-site. Is that what we're discussing, one versus the other?
I believe so, that you're deciding whether we should stay with the current guidelines which dictate or give the applicant the option versus eliminating the option for an in lieu fee.
Right, okay. Just wanted to clarify that again.
Commissioner Erickson?
I guess it's not clear to me why the third option, which would be actually including a below market price unit in the planned development in the hillside, isn't a third option. And if one doesn't increase the density in that planned development because there's a below market price unit in that, so in Tom's hypothetical one, either there's 10 lots or there's not 10 lots, and you develop one below market, the number of below market price.
Right.
You get 11.
Well, because we don't count the BMP in the density.
You won't get 10, you'll get 11.
Yeah. So we don't count it. So in essence, you would end up with more density if you require it on site.
You don't take the 10 and say one of those.
You could.
But the developer can come in and say, I only want to build 10.
I only want to build 10 and one.
No,
yeah.
You're going to put a BMP unit in. He says, okay, that's 11. Because he gets the bonus. We don't count that. So you could put in 10, but we can't count the other one, so you get 11. And that's the only way it'll ever cancel out.
Theoretically, they could say, I'm going to do 10, and one of those 10 is the BMP, but it's not usual.
Well, so that Okay, I didn't understand that. So that inherently puts developing below market price housing in conflict with density in the town.
In the hills.
In the hillsides. The concern from what I
general,
understand.
Whether it's in the hills or not in the hills.
I think there's a heightened level of concern for density in the hillsides.
Because we all look at the hillsides, supposedly.
Yeah. So well, yeah. It's a whole series of economic financial concerns that drive market the value of, so then when you set up the equation where they're having to justify it on a financial basis, clearly whether or not you require below market price housing as a part of the development or not affects the market value of the land over a long time. So the more you encourage, it will drive the value of the land down, which is okay, which potentially is okay because it makes the value of the land less, therefore it more affordable, particularly in a community like Los Gatos, which has affordability issues based on the value of residences. So one has to decide. So one can't just assume that. It seems to me that.
I'm not sure that follows.
Yeah.
If you have a seller of land who says, I'm going to sell you Blackacre, which is 10 acres for 1 acre houses, and I'm going to sell it to you for whatever the going price of land is, he doesn't care that much about the developer's problem. And the developer says, I'm prepared to sell those 10 units for, let's say, land and units to $20 million. We make him put in another unit, so he does that. Essentially, I don't think he has to make a profit on that unit. He will, I suppose. But
no, he probably would not make a profit. He'd probably lose money on the unit.
Well, but he gets his 10 units anyway.
Yeah, it's an extra unit.
And he would have had to pay 6% if it went in lieu fee, and on 20, I don't know what we value, whether it's the land or the finished product.
It's the building valuation.
Not the improvements.
The improvements, not the land.
If you could buy a house, you're buying the land and the building.
But I believe it's just on the actual building. It's on the building valuation. It's just on the building plans. They're valued.
Okay, so it's like the building permit. If then in the hypothetical we had, it was $10 million for land, $10 million for buildings, that'd be $600,000, which would be an in lieu fee. But instead of an in lieu fee, we're saying build a unit. Well, we just said if he has to contribute the land, which was $1 million, and he has to build a unit, which was whatever, but we called it $1 million. You're right, he's going to lose a lot of money.
Because we have to remember that if we're looking at moderate, we're looking at 120% of area median income. That's the cap, and that's going to set the price. So I think you're looking at, for a family of four, is like 120-something thousand. So it's whatever a family of four can afford. So it's very difficult, if not impossible, to be able to provide that unit within those financial constraints. They're losing a lot of money, in other words.
Commissioner Jensen?
I want to go back to something really fundamental. It just strikes me that listening to the discussion, back to what Commissioner O'Donnell said, is that the overall goal is that we want to produce units. The in lieu fee is not producing units. However, it goes up and down. If really the net that we spent is $400,000 and haven't created a new unit, that's an argument for why in lieu fee isn't a good solution. So what I heard Commissioner O'Donnell say is put the burden on the developer in the hillside to demonstrate why you, A, can't build a unit, B, can't purchase a unit, and if you meet that burden, whatever the town council decides that burden may consist of, be it financial constraints, least restrictive development area, whatever it may be, why you can't do it, then you can contribute to the in lieu fee. Because right now, what we're doing is we're having a default to the in lieu fee. And that hasn't really served this program that well. Nobody remembers probably the phantom parking spaces downtown. I'm the only one. Everybody used to contribute to a fund for a parking space downtown. and that was great. There was no parking. But everybody said, well, I have 20 parking spaces. Well, that's great. There aren't 20 parking spaces. So this kind of strikes me not quite the same, but if the goal is to actually get the unit, it doesn't seem like we're doing that. So I would say, can't we do something where we recommend to the town council that we think the burden should be on the developer to demonstrate why building a unit or buying a unit doesn't work, and if you demonstrate that, then great, pay us the money.
And I think your report says we could do that.
Yes. In fact, the GPC discussed that. That's what staff had brought to them as a recommendation, that there be some requirement that the developer provide a financial, showing why it is infeasible to be able to build on site, and therefore they either have to build off site or they have to pay the in lieu fee. And we can do that.
Other questions, discussions? Are we in a position, we already talked about the first issue, and we all agreed, if I could remember what the first issue was, but we'll go back to that. But we now remember, even I, the second issue, and it sounds to me like what Commissioner Jensen said may be something we could all agree with, which would be nice, and that would take care of the second issue. So would you remind me of the first issue?
The first issue is the exception to the home buyer, first-time home buyer provision for tenants in condo conversion projects. And I think I heard clearly that I think the Planning Commission's recommendation is that the exception be allowed for those that one unique situation.
And the second issue, we have a suggestion on the table that the burden simply be placed, and this, we're talking about the hillside, we're talking about planned unit developments, really, whether it's narrow or not, that's what the area is. And we're saying the burden is simply on the developer to prove why they can't put an actual unit up there rather than paying an in lieu, or, I guess, reversing that, why they can't put a unit there, failing that, buy a unit down in town, or failing that, then and only then they get to put the in lieu up. That's the suggestion. Do we have people who disagree with that suggestion? Therefore, I take it that we all agree with that, so we have now disclosed the two items. So I think
so just
getting close to going home.
so that I have clarity. So it's the developer has to prove, it's the burden of proof on the developer as to why they cannot build it in the hillside in conjunction with their project, or that they can provide the unit by buying a unit in town. And if either of those, they show that they cannot do that, then they would be allowed the in lieu fee option. Okay?
That's it.
Good, good.
Okay.
Do we need to make a motion to that effect? Or?
Yes, because this is a draft ordinance and resolution, so.
There's nothing open, but
So moved.
What did you want to talk about?
Well, I've been listening to this on TV, and obviously I may have missed something significant in coming down and I did have on the hillside and the issue.
Well, we just moved and seconded and voted in favor of it, so I don't.
And by the way, I probably could have gotten in here before you did that, except the door there is locked and the door there is locked.
We're really sorry about that. Now, I guess the issue is, I don't think there's anything before us. If you want to get up and talk, we're glad to listen to you.
And
See, I don't know what you said.
And Lee, this is actually going to go to the town council, so you will have an opportunity at that time too.
Go right ahead.
Thank you. Lee Quintana, 5 Palm Avenue. I was home listening to this, and there was a lot of discussion about in lieu of fee and the hillside and why it wasn't
Stop for 1 second. Do you know what we just did?
No, I don't. I was in my car.
Let me tell you what we just did. Maybe it'll have something to impact on what you're going to tell us. If I can remember what we just did. We did two things. We spoke to the first-time buyer, and we said, you got to be a first-time buyer. It doesn't make any difference what happens in the condo conversion. If you're in the condo conversion, you are a first-time buyer if you didn't know about it and they hadn't taken the steps necessary.
I can save you time. I don't have any comments on that part.
Then on the other one, on the in lieu, we said, and we were only talking about in the hillside and plan unit developments. And we said there, the burden is on the developer to show why he can't add an actual unit to his development. If he can meet that burden, then he has to go buy a unit not in the hillside. And if he can show why he can't do that, then to the whatever standards the town council sets up, then and only then is he able, I'm saying he, but it could be a she, is able to use the in lieu. So it is a presumptively you're going to build it, and if you're not going to build it, you're going to buy one, and if you can't buy one, then and only then the in lieu. So that's what we just did. That has anything to do with what you want to say. I just shared that with you.
Well, it may or may not, but basically what I was looking at, your discussion was on wanting to keep the density in the hillsides down. I agree with that, but I think it's also a question of intensity, and you can add another unit, say to 10 units and have 11, and instead of having 10 units that are 6,000 square feet, you can have 6 that are, or whatever the maximum amount would be, and one that was, in other words, you could have 9 that were standard what you were going to do, and on the 10th lot that would have been the 10th lot, you can divide it into possibly 2 lots depending on, this is all hypothetical because I don't have an example in front of me, develop the same amount of square footage on that lot, but instead of having one big house, you have 2 houses, one which is a nice size and one that is potentially smaller size that would be, obviously a BMP unit would have to be a lot smaller, but when you're building an almost 6,000 square foot house or more, seems like you could build 2 nice sized houses, one smaller than the other, that would be equivalent to a BMP unit in town, and not have the appearance of adding to the intensity, because your square footage would be the same. You have higher density, but the intensity would be the same or less. That was my point, and that was the point that I didn't see being made. The other one being that I've always assumed that it really is the goal of this town to have affordable housing throughout the town, and it's just my opinion, but I don't see why that can't happen in the hillsides as well. And they're not, that it be what if the council were to make some kind of provision for this graduating thing, like you said, that it be weighted very heavily towards putting it in the hillside, and the criteria be very high to have to be allowed to purchase it in town or put in lieu. If that's the reason for BMPs, and that's what I've always thought there were, and I always thought we try to make them indistinguishable. And we used to have more affordable housing in the hillsides than we do now.
We used to have more affordable housing everywhere. Does anybody have any
That's true
questions?
too, but it's still more affordable in town than it is in the hillsides.
Does anybody have any questions? Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you. I'm sorry.
Well, we appreciate you driving down. Thank you. Do we have anything else?
Well, we have on page 8 of the staff report is the recommended motion. I think we have clarity on the 2 issues, so you don't have to repeat those if you don't want to.
Where's the recommended motion? All right, so the recommendations are subparagraph B, which is on page 8. And the recommendations there are to forward the draft BMP guidelines to the town council with the recommendation to adopt the draft resolution approving the program revisions. And we did make 2 findings supplementing that and changing it. Okay, then it says any suggested changes should be recommended by a consensus motion, which I think we've already had.
Correct.
Make the required finding that the zoning ordinance amendments are consistent with the general plan, and forward a recommendation to the town council for adoption of the amendments to the zoning ordinance. Does anybody want to make that motion?
So moved.
Okay. And that includes what I just said, that we made those two changes.
I'll second it if you...
We have a motion and we have a second. All those in favor say aye. Aye.
Aye.
Anyone opposed? One abstention.
Thank you.
Thank you, John. Is there anything else?
Just one director's communication item that you probably heard. The Union subdivision, the 3-lot subdivision, was appealed to the town council, and I believe it's scheduled for the first meeting in November.
Okay. I had not heard that. Thank you. Any questions, comments? Yes, Commissioner Erickson?
What happened with the Francis Oaks property at the town council meeting?
You don't want to know.
No, I'm just more.
It was 5-0. Reverse the planning commission.
I
knew what the vote was, but I'm more.
I was there, and I think that the council had a very good deliberation. I think they're sensitive to the planning commission, but I think they felt that the planning commission felt that the access easement could be a liability issue for the town. They did not feel that way, so they felt that that if that was the chief reason, and that was their opinion, that the subdivision was denied, then they did not see the reasoning in that, and they reversed the decision.
I would say, because I watched it, the learning experience, I think, was that each of the council people said, and I believe them, that they went over more than once the record of what we did, and they really could not find out why we did it. You recall, we thought it didn't meet the subdivision ordinance, I think C and D or whatever the two were, and they said they just couldn't find why we thought that. And perhaps had they found why we did it, they still would have had the same result, but it was disturbing as a planning commissioner to think perhaps we didn't make our record as clear as we could have. I don't think it would have altered the result, but at least I would have felt better that I, in my part of it, would have made the record clearer, because I listened to all 5 of those council people, and I'm convinced they looked, and I'm also convinced they didn't find. So, but I'm thirdly convinced that they didn't agree with our take on the facts, and that's fine. That's their job. So the next time we have one of those, let's make sure we're crystal clear on why we're deciding that way. Commissioner Erickson.
Does that, to the chair then, does that mean that we should look at the minutes more carefully before we pass them to be sure that the record is clear, that we should be more fully...
I think when we make a motion...
That was going to be my second question. We make a motion that we should more fully articulate the rationale behind the motion. That was
right.
Yeah. Okay.
Right. Because they thought that perhaps one of the biggest issues we had was the access. I think that, some of us might differ with that, and some of us might agree with that. I don't know, and it isn't really important at this point. But they had to really look around, and they said, we're not quite sure why they did that. So, Commissioner Telesfor?
No, that's right.
So I know that I came away after I wasn't real happy initially, and then I realized it's a good learning experience, and I thought, okay, perhaps we weren't clear enough, and next time we'll be clear. And they still may say that they don't agree with us, but at least we'll have done our job to satisfy ourselves. Any other questions? Thank you all. We're adjourned.
Thank you.
Thank you. We've had a long day.